Hi guys, I'm Jeef, current rank 1 on the NA leaderboards and the only NA player to have ever hit 20k MR, and I compiled 10 of what I think are the most important tips to help you guys climb to 10k.
Wow.
I know I've made this guide before, but it's been a year since the last guide, and I just felt like some of the things in the meta changed a lot, and also I've become a much better player, so I wanted to update you guys with better information. This time, we're going to start with some early game tips and move on to the end game. This video will only cover the fundamentals, so no trinket specific tips. Let's jump straight into it. Starting off with our first early game tip, do not roll if you don't have to. Your mind should not even be thinking about what comp to play and should be more focused on how to build the strongest board possible to preserve HP. In the first 5 turns, it's way too early to look for specific units in the shop, and the gold spent rolling for them could be spent on tavern spells or even leveling. You really shouldn't be rolling more than once in the early game. The stronger your board is, the easier it is to level in the mid game and start looking for that higher tavern tier direction. Here's an example. It's very common that you buy turn 1 and then level turn 2 and turn 3 rolls around. If you have a Elemental or a Patient Scout in your shop, you can buy that unit, sell off the token, and then buy another good unit without rolling, leaving you with 3 fighting units on your board. If instead you have a 2-cost spell in your shop, you can buy the 2-cost spell plus the best unit in your shop. And if you have none of the above, then of course it's not really possible to play the turn efficiently, so you may just have to buy 1 unit and then buy the 1-cost spell in your shop and roll once. You can also choose to level to Tavern 3 on turn 3 in this case. In any case, if you have a play that utilizes all of your gold without rolling, that's probably the best play. My tip number 2 for the early game is to not buy trash and just level instead. Let me explain. A unit is good if it has good synergy or standalone tempo. Crackling Cyclone and Glow Gullet are generally good cards that have insane standalone tempo because they can trade 2 for 1 with minions of the opposite team. Synergistic combos are also quite strong in the early game, such as Party Elemental and Molten Rock. Every elemental then played will make your board quite strong for the early game, and even though you're not necessarily committed to playing elementals, it'll definitely save you a lot of HP so you can level fast. Apart from synergies and tempo units, econ minions are quite good as well. Cards such as Elemental, Shell Collector, and Warder Vault are cards that I value highly because they are cheap to buy while putting a minion on your board. If you find yourself with a shop with no synergistic combos, no standalone minions, and no econ minions, the chances are you just want to level. I think it's a disaster outcome if you buy these trash units like these cord pullers that do nothing, and your board is guaranteed mediocre in the mid game, whereas leveling gives you a high chance of recovering after buying good units. Moving on to a mid game, my third tip is to pick a turn to stabilize. 10% of the time you get the God Opener in the early game, such as Lava Lurker plus Thaumaturgist plus Zesty Shaker or something, and your board is so stable, the entire mid game you can just level to 5 or even 6 without taking damage. 90% of games are not like this, and you're going to need to stabilize. So what does this actually mean? Those 1-drops and 2-drops you bought the first 5 turns, you need to replace those units with better cards, or at least buff your board so that your units can fight. If you have less than 7 units, you really want to buy standalone cards or synergistic good cards to spike your board. Humongous and Bonker are typical examples of stabilization cards because they just individually add a ton of stats to your board. Cards such as Time Management or Defender's Rights are also very common stabilizing cards. Note that stabilizing cards probably will not end up on your final board, but they might be the difference between taking 15 damage versus taking 7 or even 0 damage. Basically, the goal of stabilizing is to try to not lose the fight, stay above damage cap, so you can level to 5 safely and keep looking for direction. So now the question is, which tavern tier do you actually want to stabilize on? Well, this one is just a bit complicated to answer because it varies a lot, but I'll give you the most important factor when choosing which tavern tier to stabilize on. Ask yourself, am I going to fall below 15 HP if I level? If the answer is yes, then you definitely want to stay down, stabilize, and try to stay above 15 HP. 15 HP is a really important breakpoint in Battlegrounds because the damage cap system prevents you from taking more than 15 HP before its top 4, making you effectively have 2 lives. You're going to want to do everything in your power and stay above damage cap, which means stabilizing whenever you're at risk of falling below it. Let's say you skipped the stabilization step and directly started looking for core pieces of your comp. Even if you landed the core pieces of the best direction in the game immediately, your comp will still need time to scale, and because you played very risky with a bad board, you'll probably just die anyways. This is why if your board is mediocre and you're at 16 HP and you need to choose between something like an Arid Atrocity that will win you the fight or an Electron with no mech setup whatsoever, you just have to pick the Atrocity to stabilize. On the other hand, if you're at 16 HP and you've already stabilized and will probably win the fight, go for the mega scaling direction, which is more likely to win the game, and in this case that is Electron. My tip number 4 is to only commit to a direction if you've enabled it. Remember when I said you're going to pick a turn to stabilize? Well, odds are those cards that helped you stabilize enabled some sort of direction. If you bought Reborn plus Turquoise Skitter, you have some reason to go Beasts. If you bought Cadaver Caretaker, you've enabled both versions of Undead Cops. I guess what I'm saying is you're not going out of your way to enable a specific direction, but you'll naturally have some direction enabled as a result of your stabilization turn and board state. This is the key part of playing what you're given. And the moment you hit your commit point for any one of these comps you've enabled, congrats, you found your direction. What you desperately want to avoid is picking the Shimmermoth without any beast setup whatsoever and saying that's your direction. You need to have a reason to pick the Shimmermoth. And that brings me to commit points. Do not mix up enablers and commit points. Let's say you have that Turquoise Skitter from early on. It turns out that a single Turquoise Skitter is not enough to commit beasts. It just simply opens up the option for you to go beasts. If you want to win with beasts, you're going to need far better scaling, such as the scaling from Shimmermoth plus Bird Buddy. That is why the commit point is usually just going to be your giga scaling engine. The role of Turquoise Skitter is to make it slightly easier for you to pick up those commit points pieces. It'll then be more natural to fit in a Bird Buddy on your board and also more natural to go into beasts. Tip number 5 is to focus on large improvements for your comp over small ones. Most of the time, you have to know what the big improvements are for your board before you start rolling, so you're able to skip the small improvements. Let's say you play combat scaling kobolds. Bonker is a tier 4 kobold that's mainly used for stabilizing, but it hardly defines your comp. If you buy a Bonker with a 3 little kobold Titus setup, that improvement is way too small to justify spending your precious gold on. Focus more on the core part of your comp, which is Kroner, Titus, more 3 little kobolds, etc. I would consider upgrading a card from a useless minion to an add-on minion such as Pokey, a meaningful upgrade, and replacing an add-on minion to a core minion such as Corrupted Bristler, also a meaningful upgrade. Any upgrade that doesn't fall into those categories is too small of an improvement. Another example is Elementals. With Lightspawn plus Drakari, which is the commit point for Elementals, you may be tempted to start buying Party Elementals and Molten Rock and also start buying random Elementals. However, those are just not significant board upgrades, and the only way you win with Elementals are finding your juicy scalers such as Localar and Mana Surge. Finding a single Localar would be more of an upgrade than buying every single elemental in your shop, and is definitely the way to win the game. I hope you get the point. Knowing what the juicy upgrades are and skipping the irrelevant upgrades in favor of big ones. Usually the big upgrades are the core cards of the comp, which I have a list of all of them in my comp guide, which is pretty much in the description of every single one of my videos. So go check it out if you haven't seen it. My tip number 6 is to concentrate stats over spreading them out. In general, you may be tempted to make sure all of your minions are equally sized so you aren't a 1 or 2 minion Andy. However, there's way more upside in concentrating stats onto 1 or 2 units if you can. There's 2 reasons for this. Reason number 1 is that bigger units value trade mid-sized units. Suppose player A didn't concentrate stats and has a board full of 100/100s. However, player B listened to my advice, built two 300/300 units, and also filled out the rest of their board with Leroys and Deadly Spores. Who wins? Well, it's always going to be the person with the concentrated stats who wins. The 300/300s can each value trade multiple mid-sized units, while the Leroys will still always 1-for-1 something. Reason number 2 on why concentrated stats is important is that it makes it much easier to sell bad units. By spreading out your stats, player A has a hard time selling any of his 100/100 units, making it tough for him to win on stats. However, player B can easily sell his support units that were used to make big units and replace them with proper ending units. An example of a comp that loves concentrating stats is Groundbreaker Nagas, and an example of a comp that spreads out stats over the whole entire board is Athissa Nagas or Lord of Gains Nagas while they were still in the game. Groundbreaker was almost always superior for this reason. So the next time you feel that your whole board needs big stats to win, just think about the power of concentrating stats. Tip number 7 is to have proper time management. To climb, eventually you're going to need to master high APM comps such as demons, murlocs, or pirates, which require a lot of quick decision making. Even if you're not playing an APM comp, this tip will come in handy. If you played a rodeo performer and you're deciding between a hired headhunter and a road less traveled, sure, one of them might be slightly better on average, but it's pretty marginal. Just pick one and move on with your life. You'll lose so many more stats perfecting every single discovery and stat point. However, you don't always want to pick the wrong discovery while playing fast. Let's say you picked wrong and realized afterwards, just make a mental note, and next time you're in that situation, you'll instantly recognize the correct pick. This is why practice is so important for playing these types of APM comps. It takes many reps, even for me, to execute them without making any mistakes. Don't expect to play perfectly first try, but the more you play, the better you'll get at the game. Eventually, executing these comps will be second-hand nature, and they're quite fun to pilot as well. Tip number 8 is to go all in at the right times. This one is actually quite an important one, so pay attention. You don't really want to go out of the game with a 2/4 brand on your board and the Leroy in your hand. You'd much rather die happy knowing that you gave it your all and put the Leroy on the board. There are a couple of reasons why you might want to cut your brand or Drukhari early and replace them with strong ending units. The most common reason is that you know that your opponent is pretty strong and you're on the verge of death. Selling the brand and slotting in Leroy, Belcher, or even Blaster can very well be the difference between living and dying, and those two placements that you save just net you 50 MMR. There are also cases where you might even go all in while playing for the win. If you've scouted the entire lobby and you find that your current opponent is the largest threat to deny your first place, you might want to eliminate them as soon as possible, without risking getting outscaled. Maybe I'm playing a demon comp, but I know that my elemental player opponent outscales me, and in that case, I may want to sell my scaling unit to eliminate them right now, guaranteeing a first place if they are knocked out. Moving on to something a bit simpler, my tip number 9 is to prepare your final board early on. Bran and Drukhari are some of the best units in the game, but they are also some of the worst ending units in the game. So what does your final board actually look like if not Bran or Drukhari? Well, if you're playing Murlocs, then your final board will likely have base skills, Belchers, and maybe Leroys. In a Bran comp, your endgame is almost always going to have you replacing your Bran with cards such as Leroy. That means instead of hoping that you hit Leroy on your last turn, anticipate needing Leroy for your final fight and buy it in advance. Same thing with Drukhari comps that can't scale the Drukhari. Leroy is such a game warping card that I'm pretty sure every single stat based comp wants 2 Leroys on their final board if possible, because it just guaranteed trades 1-for-1 on their board. However, Leroy isn't good into every matchup. You want to anticipate what your next few matchups will be and evaluate whether you need the Leroy or not. If you anticipate stats based matchups, definitely buy and hold Leroys, but against beasts and undeads, Leroys will not be necessary. And finally, let's cover tip number 10. look for opportunities to pivot. You can be a good player by properly committing to a top 4 direction and never pivoting out of it. You can be a great player by pivoting out of a top 4 direction into a top 1 direction in some spots. There are 2 conditions to pivoting. 1, you must pivot into a better scaling comp, and 2, you need to be in a good spot. The first condition is pretty straightforward. How likely is your current scaling going to win the game? If you're playing Nala or Pirates, something with relatively low cap scaling, chances are not very high. But let's say the current meta's best tribes are mechs and you stumbled upon copies of the core cards for this meta comp, which is Electron. Well, suddenly you'll be able to pivot into a much better scaling engine. It's not always that straightforward though. Most of the time, if you sell your non-mechs to put in puny mechs on your board and try to start scaling them, you're dead. Which brings me to my second point. Your spot needs to be really good. Good enough to be able to ditch your top 4 scaling for potential top 1 scaling. Usually this is a combination of high HP total and lots of economy. You need to be confident that during your pivot turn, after you take 15, you can still recover from it and build a board that is already stronger than your previous scaling. If you can't guarantee that you'll get stronger within 2 turns of pivoting, just don't bother pivoting. An example of the most common pivot in the history of Battlegrounds are pivots from APM Pirates into the best comp. Historically, Pirates are a very economy heavy tribe with a lack of major scaling, so even with 30 gold a turn, they can still be outscaled. However, using that 30 gold a turn to pivot into say demons, a much higher cap scaling comp, is how you guarantee yourself top 1, whereas sticking to Pirates will usually not be good enough for top 1. Demons and Murlocs are generally good tribes to pivot into because of their explosive scaling, meaning that with a brand they can get really big within 1 to 2 turns. On the other hand, Drukhari comps are not so good to pivot into because of their reliance on their end of turn scaling. So you'll need to scale across multiple turns to get really strong. Thus, be sure you have a clear game plan of what to pivot into and think about how big you'll get. This is the end of the guide. Hope you enjoyed. If you haven't watched my 2025 updated leveling guide yet, I highly recommend you do so. It goes even more in depth than this video and should help you a ton with your journey to 10K. Of course, subscribe if you like this content and want more, and see you in the next guide.